There is a creature in the fossil record that almost nobody talks about the right way. Its name is Troodon, and when you hear it described in most places, you hear it described as a small dinosaur, a hunter, a meat eater with large eyes and grasping hands. That description is technically accurate. It is also almost entirely beside the point, because what Troodon represents, when you look at the numbers, when you sit with the mathematics of its brain, and the trajectory of its lineage, is something far more unsettling than a predator. What Troodon represents is a question. And the question is this: what if intelligence was not our idea? 66 million years ago, a rock roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across crossed the orbit of the Earth at approximately 20 kilometers per second and struck the shallow sea that covered what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The impact released energy estimated at more than 1 billion times the power of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In the immediate aftermath, the sky above North America was on fire. The shockwave killed everything within hundreds of kilometers, almost instantly. The debris thrown into the upper atmosphere blocked sunlight across the entire planet. Temperatures plummeted, photosynthesis collapsed. The food chains that had supported life on land for over 160 million years fell apart within months, and possibly within weeks. When the accounting was finished, roughly 75% of all species on Earth were gone, the non-avian dinosaurs among them. But here is the part that almost no one pauses on long enough. That event, the Chicxulub impact, the extinction, the great dying at the end of the Cretaceous period, was not inevitable. It was not written into the structure of the universe. It was a rock moving through space at a particular angle, at a particular speed, on a particular day. Slightly different trajectory, and it misses. Slightly different composition, and it burns up before it hits. A cosmic accident so specific, so contingent on factors that had nothing to do with the direction of evolution on Earth, that it almost certainly did not have to happen. And in the lineage of Troodon and its relatives, in that extraordinary family of dinosaurs we call troodontids, there was something developing that the rock interrupted. Something that the past 40 years of paleontology has made increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. There was, in the late Cretaceous, an animal moving toward intelligence. Not toward human intelligence, not toward anything we would immediately recognize, but toward something. And if the rock had missed, the question of where that something might have gone over the following 66 million years is one of the most genuinely strange questions in all of science. Tonight, we are going to sit with that question. We are going to begin where the science begins. In the fossil beds of Montana and Alberta and New Mexico, in the laboratory analyses of endocasts and limb ratios and encephalization quotients, in the careful and sometimes heated arguments of paleontologists trying to read a mind from a skull. And then we are going to move where the science invites us to move, carefully, honestly, with full awareness of what we know and what we are speculating, into the world as it might have been. A world where the asteroid missed. A world where 66 million years of additional evolution acted on an animal that was already, by any reasonable measure, the most cognitively sophisticated non-avian dinosaur that had ever lived. A world where intelligence on this planet might have taken a shape so different from our own that the very concept of intelligence becomes strange and new. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if this is your first time, let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. I am always curious to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you have not already. Take a deep breath. Let the modern world go quiet. And let us go back, far back, to a world that almost was. To understand what was lost, or rather what was interrupted, you need to understand what Troodon actually was. Not the cartoon version, not the pop science shorthand. The real animal, as best as we can reconstruct it from the fossils that survive. Trudon formosus, the species whose remains are most extensively documented, lived during the late Cretaceous period, roughly 75 to 66 million years ago, in what is now the northern reaches of North America. The name itself means wounding tooth, and it was given by the paleontologist Joseph Leidy in 1856, based on a single unusual serrated tooth found in Montana. For most of the following century, Trudon was a mystery, a tooth without a body, a name attached to almost nothing. It was not until the 1970s and 80s, with discoveries in the Two Medicine Formation of Montana and the Horseshoe Canyon Formation of Alberta, that the picture began to fill in. Paleontologists, including Jack Horner, who would later become famous for his work on Maiasaura and his influential ideas about dinosaur behavior, helped establish Trudon as a coherent animal rather than a fragment. And what emerged from those years of work was an animal that surprised almost everyone. Trudon was small by dinosaur standards. An adult stood roughly 1 meter tall at the hip and stretched about 2 meters from snout to tail tip, putting it somewhere in the size range of a large turkey or a small ostrich. It weighed, in most estimates, between 40 and 60 kilograms. It moved on 2 legs, like all theropod dinosaurs, and its hind limbs were long and slender in proportion to its body, suggesting it was fast and agile. Its forelimbs were relatively long for a theropod, ending in 3-fingered hands with curved claws that could pronate inward, giving it something approaching a grasping capability. Its feet bore a large, recurved claw on the second toe, similar to, but less dramatically enlarged, than the famous sickle claw of its close relative Velociraptor. This claw was likely used for pinning prey rather than slashing, a precision tool rather than a blunt weapon. Its skull was long and narrow, with a relatively short snout compared to many other theropods, and it is the skull that matters most, because the skull of Trudon is the place where the story of intelligence begins. Stand in any natural history museum that has a Trudon mount and look at the brain case. Even in the bone, you can see it. The brain case is large, dramatically large relative to the overall size of the skull, in a way that is immediately visually striking even to an untrained eye. Paleontologists quantify this quality using a measure called the encephalization quotient, or EQ, which compares the actual brain size of an animal to the expected brain size for an animal of its body mass, based on statistical averages across a broad range of species. An EQ of 1 means the brain is exactly the size you would predict. An EQ below 1 means the brain is smaller than expected. An EQ above 1 means the brain is larger than expected. And in animals, a higher EQ is generally, though not perfectly, correlated with more complex behavior, greater learning capacity, and more sophisticated social and environmental cognition. Most non-avian dinosaurs had EQ values well below 1. Brachiosaurus, one of the largest sauropod dinosaurs, had an EQ estimated at around 0.6, meaning its brain was roughly 60% the size you would predict for a vertebrate of its mass. Stegosaurus, famously, had an EQ so low, around 0.6 as well, that it contributed to the long-standing and not entirely fair popular image of dinosaurs as irredeemably stupid. Even large and behaviorally sophisticated theropods like Tyrannosaurus rex, formidable as it was, had an EQ estimated somewhere between 1.5 and 2, meaning its brain was perhaps twice the size expected for an animal of its mass. That is actually not bad. It is comparable to many modern birds and some mammals, but it is not what Trudon had. Trudon's EQ has been estimated at approximately 5.8. Some analyses push it higher, towards 6. Let that number sit for a moment. The brain of Trudon was nearly 6 times larger, relative to body size, than you would expect for a vertebrate animal of similar mass. For comparison, modern crows and ravens, which are among the most cognitively sophisticated birds alive today, and routinely demonstrate behaviors including tool use, future planning, and what researchers cautiously describe as theory of mind, have EQ values in the range of 2 to 3. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have EQ values around 2.4. The average EQ for the genus Homo, meaning humans and our most recent ancestors, sits around 7 to 8. Troodon, a dinosaur that went extinct 66 million years ago, had a brain-to-body ratio that fell comfortably between the chimpanzee and the modern human. This is not a minor footnote in paleontology. This is one of the most startling measurements in the entire fossil record. And yet, it rarely receives the sustained attention it deserves, perhaps because it is easier to think of dinosaurs as a closed chapter, as creatures that had their moment and were appropriately replaced. But the numbers do not care about our narrative preferences. The numbers say that something was happening in the theropod lineage that led to Troodon, something that had been building for tens of millions of years, and that, in the late Cretaceous, had produced an animal with a brain architecture and a relative brain size that placed it, in cognitive terms, in territory we instinctively associate with the most intelligent creatures alive today. There is more than the brain size. The brain is the headline, but the body tells a supporting story that reinforces the headline at every turn. Troodon had enormous eyes, proportionally enormous, not merely large in the way that most predatory dinosaurs had large eyes, but genuinely remarkable in their relative size to the skull. The orbits, the bony eye sockets, occupy a very large fraction of the facial region of the skull. Analysis of the scleral rings, the rings of tiny bones that support the eye within the orbit in many reptiles and birds, suggests that Troodon had eyes whose diameter may have approached the extreme upper limits of what the skull geometry could accommodate. Estimates of the actual eye diameter in living Troodon vary, but most reconstructions place the eyes in a size range that would have provided exceptional low-light vision. One influential analysis of Troodon's scleral rings by Lars Schmitz and Ryosuke Motani, published in 2011, used the geometry of these rings to infer the pupil shape and visual ecology of the animal, and concluded that Troodon was likely cathemeral or nocturnal, meaning it was active during low-light conditions, dawn, dusk, and possibly the full dark of a Cretaceous night. This is significant. Large eyes suited to dim conditions are an investment. They require significant developmental resources to produce and maintain. Animals do not evolve such eyes without a corresponding need and ability to use them. Troodon, it appears, was hunting in the dark. And hunting in the dark is cognitively demanding in ways that hunting in broad daylight is not. It requires more sophisticated sensory integration, more flexible behavioral response, more reliance on learned terrain knowledge rather than simple visual pursuit. The hands deserve attention as well. Theropod dinosaurs in general had forelimbs that reduced in size and complexity over their evolutionary history, and many later species, including the tyrannosaurs, had forelimbs so reduced as to be nearly vestigial. Troodon went in the opposite direction, at least in functional terms. Its arms were relatively long, its wrists were capable of a degree of lateral flexion unusual in theropods, and the fingers bore curved, recurved claws that could be used with some independence. When researchers model the range of motion available in Troodon's forelimb joints, what emerges is an animal that could bring its hands together in front of its body, orient them somewhat inward, and apply them to objects in its environment with a level of dexterity that very few other dinosaurs could match. This is not a prehensile grip in the primate sense. Troodon could not pick up a stone the way you are picking up this idea, but the movement space available to it suggests an animal that was using its forelimbs for more than simple grasping of prey. The hands were capable of something more refined than that, and refinement of the hands, in the evolutionary record across many lineages, tends to go with refinement of the brain. Troodon also laid eggs in a way that differs from most other dinosaurs we know well, and the difference is behaviorally interesting. Fossil nests attributed to Troodon, discovered by John R. Horner and Robert McKeeler in Montana in the late 1970s, and studied more extensively over subsequent decades, show an arrangement that suggests the eggs were partially buried and partially exposed, positioned upright with their narrow ends down in a ring pattern within a raised rim of sediment. This is unlike the fully buried clutches of many other dinosaurs, and more similar in some respects to the partially covered, attended nests of modern crocodilians and birds. What it suggests, when interpreted alongside other evidence, is that Troodon sat on or very near its nest, in a brooding posture, maintaining the eggs at appropriate temperatures and potentially defending them. Brood care is not uniquely associated with intelligence, but it is associated with a kind of behavioral investment in offspring that, across evolutionary time, tends to correlate with longer developmental periods, more post-hatching parental interaction, and the kind of extended parent-offspring relationship through which learned behaviors can be transmitted. In short, it is part of the profile of an animal whose young were not born fully formed and immediately independent, but who learn things from the adults around them. And then there is the question of the troodontid lineage itself, the broader evolutionary context in which Troodon sat. Troodon was not an isolated anomaly. It was a member of a family of small, large-brained, large-eyed, long-limbed theropods that had been evolving and diversifying for millions of years, with representatives found in North America, Asia, and possibly Europe and Antarctica. Species like Sauroornithoides from Mongolia, Borogovia from the late Cretaceous of Asia, and the remarkable Mei Long, found in China in a sleeping posture with its head tucked under its arm like a modern bird, all speak to a clade of animals that were refining the same basic cognitive and sensory investment in parallel across multiple continents. The troodontids were not a one-off experiment. They were a sustained trajectory, a lineage that had been selecting for larger brains, more sophisticated sensory apparatus, and more behaviorally flexible animals over a span of tens of millions of years. And Troodon, at the end of the Cretaceous, was the most cognitively advanced product of that trajectory we have yet found. The paleontologist Dale Russell, working at the National Museum of Canada in the 1980s, took this trajectory seriously enough to ask a question that most of his colleagues considered, at best, audacious. He asked, if the Chicxulub impact had not occurred, where might the troodontid lineage have gone? What would 66 million additional years of the same selective pressures that have produced Troodon, including selection for larger brains, better sensory integration, greater behavioral flexibility, and more sophisticated manipulation, have produced? Russell, working with the sculptor Ron Seguin, built a physical model of the hypothetical descendant he calculated, a creature he called the Dinosauroid. The model became one of the most discussed and argued over objects in popular paleontology. It was humanoid in overall body plan, because Russell's calculations suggested that the same postural and biomechanical pressures that had shaped human body form might apply to a bipedal, large-brained animal regardless of its ancestry. The Dinosauroid was upright, with a large domed cranium, large forward-facing eyes, reduced tail, and 3-fingered hands. It looked, frankly, like nothing so much as a reptilian humanoid from a science fiction novel. And that, as we will see, is actually where the most interesting scientific conversation begins. Not because Russell was right in his specific prediction, but because the question he was asking was the right one. And the answer, as paleontology and evolutionary biology have refined it over the 40 years since his model was built, is considerably stranger and more interesting than anything a humanoid figure could capture. But let us slow down before the thought experiment runs away from us. Let us return to the actual animal, to the specific things the fossil record has given us to work with, and look more carefully at what those things tell us. Because the details matter, and the details are more interesting than the headlines. The discovery history of Troodon is itself a remarkable story of how science works. How a single tooth can sit in a museum drawer for over a century while its owner remains almost entirely unknown. And how the accumulation of specimens over decades can transform our understanding of an animal in ways that early discoverers could not have predicted. When Joseph Leidy named Troodon formosus in 1856, he was working from a single laterally compressed tooth with distinctive serrations found in the Judith River Formation of Montana and sent to him by the frontier naturalist Ferdinand van der Veer Hayden. The tooth was odd enough that Leidy recognized it as something new. The name Formosus means beautiful, and Leidy apparently chose it for the elegant form of the serrations along the tooth's edge. But one beautiful tooth does not tell you much about an animal. For the next 100 years, Troodon remained essentially a tooth with a name attached, its relationships to other dinosaurs debated, its body plan unknown. The picture began to fill in with work in Alberta and Montana through the 1970s and 80s. In the Horseshoe Canyon Formation of Alberta, multiple partial skeletons began to accumulate, enough material to establish the general body proportions, the limb ratios, the size and shape of the hands and feet and tail. In the Two Medicine Formation of Montana, the discovery of nesting sites and associated skeletal material began to reveal something of the animal's reproductive biology and social behavior. Philip Currie, working at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, Alberta, was one of the key figures in this period of rapid discovery, publishing detailed analyses of Troodon cranial and postcranial material that established many of the characteristics now associated with the animal. Currie was also one of the first researchers to draw serious attention to the implications of the brain size, framing the encephalization question in terms that made it impossible to ignore, even for researchers skeptical of what it meant. The brain case of Troodon preserves more detail than is typical for theropod dinosaurs of its time. And this is fortunate because the brain case is the key evidence for the cognitive arguments. The inner surface of the brain case, when filled with latex or plaster to create what paleoanthropologists call an endocast, a cast of the brain's outer surface, reveals the general shape of the brain in considerable detail. The endocast of Troodon shows a brain that is elongated front to back, with relatively large cerebral hemispheres and very large optic lobes, the regions associated with the visual processing. The olfactory lobes, associated with smell, are smaller relative to overall brain size than in many other theropods, suggesting that vision rather than smell was the primary sense driving behavioral decisions. The cerebellum, involved in coordination and motor control, is relatively well developed. What the endocast cannot tell us directly is the internal organization of the brain, the specific circuits and structures that govern particular behaviors, because soft tissue does not preserve in fossils. But the external morphology of the endocast gives us enough to work with, enough to compare with other animals, enough to ground the EQ calculations that have made Troodon's brain the most discussed theropod brain in paleontology. One of the more recent contributions to this picture came from work using computed tomography scanning, the same basic technology used in medical CT scanners, applied to Troodon specimens. CT scanning allows researchers to examine the internal structure of fossils without physically cutting them open, which is enormously valuable because it preserves irreplaceable specimens while still revealing internal details. CT studies of Troodon specimens published in the early 2000s confirmed and refined the earlier endocast analyses, and also revealed details of the inner ear anatomy that had not been visible in earlier work. The inner ear morphology of Troodon, specifically the size and proportions of the semicircular canals, suggests a level of vestibular sensitivity, the sense of balance and spatial orientation that is consistent with an active, agile animal capable of rapid changes in head position and orientation. This is not surprising in a fast-moving predator, but it adds another layer to the picture of an animal with a highly integrated sensory system, one in which multiple streams of precise sensory information were being processed simultaneously and used to guide complex behavior. The question of exactly how social Troodon was remains genuinely open, and this honesty about the limits of what we know is important. The nesting evidence from Montana is suggestive of proximity between multiple nesting individuals, but proximity is not the same as social complexity. Crocodilians, for example, nest in proximity in some species without maintaining the kind of ongoing social relationships that produce high cognitive demands. The nesting evidence from Troodon is more consistent with active brooding and parental care than with crocodilian behavior, and the combination of parental care with the other indicators of cognitive sophistication, the large brain, the flexible diet, the nocturnal activity, does paint a picture of an animal with a richer behavioral repertoire than most other theropods. But we should be careful not to read more into the evidence than it actually contains. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What we can say with confidence is that the conditions were present that, in other lineages and in other times, have produced social complexity. Whether those conditions had already produced it in Troodon is a question the fossil record cannot yet answer definitively. The geographic range of troodontids, which extends from North America to Asia and possibly beyond, is itself important evidence. A lineage that has spread across multiple continents, adapting to different environments while maintaining its basic cognitive and sensory architecture, is a successful lineage, not an ecological marginal. The Asian troodontids, including the spectacular May long specimen found in China in 2004, the individual preserved in a sleeping posture with its head tucked under its arm, in the exact position of a modern roosting bird, tell us that the theropod to bird transition, the evolutionary process through which the avian body plan emerged from theropod ancestors, was intimately entangled with the cognitive and behavioral evolution of this entire clade. May Long was not sleeping in that position by accident. It was sleeping in that position because the behavior of tucking the head under the arm for thermoregulation and rest was already present in the troodontid and related lineages, a behavior we now recognize immediately in modern birds, because it is a direct inheritance from these Cretaceous ancestors. When you see a bird tuck its head under its wing, you are seeing a behavior that goes back at least 125 million years, to the early Cretaceous, predating Troodon by 50 million years. The thread of behavioral continuity in the dinosaurian lineage is long and real and traceable. Before we follow the troodontids into the deep future of the world that almost was, we need to spend some time in the world as it actually was, in the Cretaceous as Troodon lived it. Because the environment that shaped this animal, the specific pressures and opportunities of the late Cretaceous ecosystem, tells us a great deal about the direction in which selection was already pushing it. And that direction, when you look carefully, is consistently and unmistakably toward greater cognitive complexity. The late Cretaceous of North America, roughly 75 to 66 million years ago, was a world almost entirely unlike the one you know. The continent was divided by a shallow inland sea, the Western Interior Seaway, which ran roughly north to south, splitting what would become North America into two landmasses. To the west lay Laramidia, a long narrow strip of land bordering a mountain range whose roots would eventually become the Rocky Mountains. To the east lay Appalachia, low and swampy and less well understood from the fossil record. It is on Laramidia where the world we are interested in played out. Close your eyes and try to build this landscape. The air is warm and humid, warmer than anything in North America today. Because the Cretaceous was a greenhouse world, with no permanent polar ice caps and atmospheric carbon dioxide levels several times higher than the present. The seasons are real but milder than today. The forests are dense and various, not the conifer-dominated forests of the earlier Mesozoic, but something beginning to shift, beginning to contain the new growth that the Cretaceous would become famous for. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, are in the process of their great evolutionary explosion, diversifying from their modest earlier beginnings into the riot of form and color that would eventually take over the world's vegetation. Flowers are still a novelty in geological terms. Grasses have not yet evolved. The undergrowth is ferns and cycads and club mosses, dark and tangled at ground level, giving way above to broadleaf trees and towering conifers whose trunks rise straight and smooth to canopies filtering the late Cretaceous light into something gold and soft. In this world, Troodon is not at the top of the food chain, not even close. The late Cretaceous fauna of Laramidia includes some of the largest and most powerful predators in the entire history of life on land. Tyrannosaurus rex, in its final evolved form, stalks the southern portions of this landmass. Daspletosaurus, an earlier and in some ways even more robustly built tyrannosaur, hunts the middle latitudes. These are animals that weigh 4 to 8 metric tons, that can crush bone with bite forces measured in the tens of thousands of newtons, that are apex predators in the most complete sense of the phrase. Troodon, at 50 kilograms, is not competing with these animals for prey. It is avoiding them. It is moving around them in the spaces they do not occupy, hunting prey they would not bother with, and surviving by being fast, alert, intelligent, and active during the hours when the giants are less likely to be on the move. This is important. The ecological niche that Troodon occupies, the small to medium predator niche in an ecosystem dominated by enormous apex hunters, is one that tends to select heavily for behavioral flexibility and cognitive sophistication. When you cannot overpower your competitors or your prey, you outthink them. You learn where the prey is moving before it gets there. You learn the patterns of the larger predators so you can avoid them. You cooperate with others of your kind if cooperation produces better outcomes than solitary hunting. You remember what worked last time, and you adjust for what did not. The cognitive demands of operating as a mid-sized predator in a complex ecosystem, surrounded by both larger threats and more nimble prey, are substantially greater than the cognitive demands of being an apex predator that can essentially walk toward almost anything and take it by force. We see this pattern in modern ecosystems. The most behaviorally sophisticated mammalian predators are rarely the largest. Wolves, which hunt in socially coordinated packs using strategies that require individual animals to maintain complex mental models of the position and behavior of both prey and packmates, are mid-sized predators by any measure. African wild dogs display hunting coordination that rivals wolves in its complexity. Orcas, despite their enormous size, are behaviorally exceptional precisely because their ancestors occupied a competitive niche that demanded social intelligence before they achieved their current apex status. The pattern is consistent enough to suggest a principle. Animals under pressure to outperform larger or faster competitors tend to evolve cognitive solutions when brute physical solutions are unavailable to them. And Troodon, small and fast in a world of giants, was under exactly that kind of pressure. What was Troodon eating? The diet question is one where the evidence is genuinely complex and somewhat surprising. The teeth of Troodon, despite the name, were not the blade-like serrated carnivore teeth of the tyrannosaurs. They were smaller and more heterodont, meaning they varied in shape across the jaw, with some teeth that look suited to puncturing, and some that look more suited to processing plant matter or invertebrates. Stomach contents are rarely preserved in the fossil record for any species, but the tooth morphology of Troodon has led a number of researchers to propose that it was omnivorous, eating a varied diet of small mammals, lizards, insects, eggs, and possibly some plant material depending on season and availability. An omnivorous diet is cognitively demanding in a specific way. It requires an animal to learn and remember a much wider range of food sources, processing techniques, and environmental cues than a strict carnivore that is essentially hunting the same type of prey using the same basic strategy over and over. An omnivore's world is more information-rich, and managing that information requires more brain. There is one more dimension of Troodon's world that matters to this story, and it is perhaps the most significant of all. Troodon was not alone. The fossil record of the Two Medicine Formation in Montana preserves evidence of multiple Troodon individuals of different ages in close proximity, And the nesting evidence in particular suggests that these animals were gathered in loose colonial or semi-colonial arrangements during at least the breeding season, with multiple nests in the same general area. This is not proof of complex social behavior in the primate sense, but it is consistent with it. And social living, across virtually every lineage that has produced high intelligence in the modern world, is both a cause and an effect of cognitive expansion. Living in groups demands that an animal track the identities, relative status, intentions, and likely behaviors of multiple other individuals simultaneously. It demands communication, whether through vocalization, body posture, display, or some combination. It demands the ability to form and maintain social bonds over time, to remember the history of relationships, to predict the behavior of familiar individuals based on past interactions. These demands are sometimes called the social brain hypothesis, the idea developed by the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar and others, that the primary driver of the extraordinary expansion of the primate brain, and specifically of the neocortex, the region most associated with complex cognition, was not the need to find food or navigate terrain, but the need to manage the computational demands of complex social life. The more complex the social group, the larger the brain region needed to track it. And larger brains, once they exist, become available for all kinds of purposes beyond the social ones that drove their initial expansion. If Troodon was living in proximity to other Troodons, communicating with them, competing with them, potentially cooperating with them, maintaining relationships with them over timescales longer than a single hunting encounter, then the social brain hypothesis predicts something specific and powerful. It predicts that social pressure alone would have been driving the expansion of cognitive capacity in this lineage, quite independently of the foraging and predator avoidance pressures already in play. Multiple independent drivers of brain expansion, all operating in the same direction, on the same animal, over millions of years. That is not a recipe for modest cognitive gains. That is a recipe for runaway encephalization. And the fossil record of Troodon, culminating in an EQ of nearly 6 at the very end of the Cretaceous, suggests that is precisely what was happening. Now let the rock miss. 66 million years ago, on a morning like any other in the late Cretaceous, the asteroid that we call Chicxulub, a dark and irregular mass of rock and metal, tumbling silently through the inner solar system, reaches its closest approach to Earth and continues past. Perhaps its trajectory was slightly off. Perhaps it struck the moon instead, close enough to leave the Earth shaken but not shattered. Perhaps it simply crossed the orbital plane at the wrong moment, when Earth was a few weeks ahead or behind in its path. The reasons do not matter for the purposes of this exploration. What matters is the consequence. The mass extinction does not happen. The non-avian dinosaurs survive. This is where speculation begins, and we need to be careful about how we proceed. Speculation grounded in evolutionary biology is not the same thing as fantasy. The history of life has patterns. Evolution has tendencies, even if it has no goals. Certain structural and ecological pressures reliably produce certain types of outcomes, not identically across different lineages, but in broad recognizable strokes. When we project into the hypothetical future of a non-extinction world, we can use those patterns as guides, keeping close to what evolutionary biology actually predicts, and marking clearly where we are moving into territory that is genuinely unknowable. The first thing to say about a world without the Chicxulub extinction is that it would not have been a world unchanged. The late Cretaceous was already a world in ecological flux. The global climate was beginning to cool slightly from its Cretaceous peak. Volcanic activity from what geologists call the Deccan Traps, a massive outpouring of lava in what is now India, was already beginning to affect atmospheric chemistry in ways that were stressing some ecosystems. Sea levels were changing. The diversity of some dinosaur groups was already showing signs of decline in certain regions. A world without the asteroid would not have been a perfectly stable world that simply continued unchanged. It would have been a world continuing to change, continuing to evolve, with the non-avian dinosaurs as the dominant tetrapods navigating those changes rather than being swept away by them. The second thing to say is that the mammals of the late Cretaceous, our ancestors, were not going to drive the dinosaurs to extinction on their own. The mammals of 66 million years ago were small. Most were no larger than a modern rat or shrew. They occupied ecological niches that the dinosaurs did not compete for heavily. The dark, the underground, the fine branches of trees, the insect-eating niches at the small end of the food chain. In a world without the extinction event, those mammals would have continued to exist, continued to diversify at the slow pace they had maintained for the preceding 100 million years of dinosaur dominance. They would not have exploded into the ecological vacuum that their ascendancy in the post-extinction world required. Without the vacuum, there would have been no explosion. Our lineage, the mammalian lineage that eventually produced the great apes and human beings, would have continued to exist as small, furtive, mostly nocturnal creatures filling niches at the margins of a dinosaur-dominated world. In the deepest sense, we would not have happened. Not us. Not anything like us. The stage, then, would have remained the dinosaurs. And on that stage, the troodontids would have continued their trajectory. The mammals of this Eocene world without the extinction deserve more than a passing mention. In the actual history of the Earth, the Eocene is the epoch in which the great mammalian orders diversified explosively, filling the ecological spaces left by the non-avian dinosaurs. Artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates that would eventually produce cattle, deer, pigs, and whales, radiated into dozens of forms. Perissodactyls, the odd-toed ungulates, produced the early horses, tapirs, and rhinoceroses. Proboscideans, the order that eventually produced elephants, appeared in Africa and began their long diversification. Primates diversified from their early, small, relatively unspecialized ancestors into a remarkable range of forms. Carnivoran mammals, the order that produced dogs, cats, bears, and seals, developed from their humble beginnings into the major predators of the mammalian world. None of this would have happened in the world without the extinction. The ecological spaces that the mammalian orders filled in the actual Eocene would have been occupied by the continuing dinosaurian fauna. The large herbivore niches filled by ungulates in our world would have remained filled by ceratopsids and hadrosaurs and sauropods. The large predator niches would have remained with the tyrannosaurs and other large carnivorous theropods. The small, fast, insectivore niches occupied by early shrews and hedgehogs and bats would have been filled by small, fast dinosaurian insectivores. In the world without the extinction, the mammals would have remained what they were in the late Cretaceous. Small, mostly nocturnal, insectivorous or omnivorous animals, filling the ecological cracks that the dinosaurs had not fully colonized. But this does not mean the mammals would have been static. Evolution does not stop for any lineage simply because the broader ecological context remains stable. The mammals of the world without the extinction would have continued to diversify within the niches available to them, and those niches, while smaller and less ecologically central than in our actual world, would still have provided opportunities for adaptation and change. The small, nocturnal insectivore niche, in particular, is one that has historically been associated with significant sensory refinement, particularly in auditory and olfactory systems. The mammals that remain in this niche in the world without the extinction would have continued to develop these sensory systems, becoming more sophisticated in their nighttime navigation, their prey detection, their social communication through scent and sound over tens of millions of years. And here is where the co-evolutionary relationship between the troodontid descendants and the mammals becomes genuinely interesting. The troodontid descendants, in their Cretaceous origins, were likely hunting the small mammals of the Cretaceous fauna as one component of their omnivorous diet. Small mammals, With their high metabolic rates and their relatively accessible nutritional content, would have been a valuable prey item for a small to medium predator with the grasping hands and quick reflexes of a troodontid. This predator-prey relationship would have created strong selection pressure on the mammalian lineages being hunted, selecting for whatever traits allowed them to avoid or escape predation by a cognitively sophisticated hunter. And the traits that help prey avoid a cognitively sophisticated predator are themselves cognitively demanding. Better spatial memory of escape routes and hiding places, better ability to model the likely behavior of the pursuing predator, faster and more flexible decision-making under pressure. This is the logic of co-evolutionary arms races. And in the world without the extinction, it would have played out over tens of millions of years between the troodontid descendants and the small mammalian lineages they preyed on and competed with. The mammals would have been under selection pressure to become cognitively more sophisticated as their primary predators became more sophisticated. The troodontid descendants would in turn have been under selection pressure to stay cognitively ahead of increasingly clever prey. This kind of evolutionary dynamic, in which predator and prey drive each other's cognitive evolution simultaneously, is one of the mechanisms evolutionary biologists invoke to explain rapid encephalization in other contexts. It would have been a sustained and powerful force in the world we are imagining. The result, over tens of millions of years, might have been a world with not one but two cognitively sophisticated lineages, the troodontid descendants at the top of the cognitive hierarchy, and the small mammalian lineages occupying a secondary cognitive tier, more sophisticated than anything alive in the actual Cretaceous, but constrained by their smaller body sizes and more marginal ecological positions. The relationship between these two tiers of intelligence in the world without the extinction would have been complex and layered. Part predator-prey dynamic, part competitive exclusion, possibly involving elements of learned avoidance and tactical behavior on both sides, that would have no real parallel in any actual ecosystem we know about. It would have been a world with more cognitive depth, more levels at which mind was operating and influencing ecological outcomes, than the world we actually live in. The troodontid descendants would not have been alone as intelligent animals. They would have been the most intelligent animals in a world that was, on average, smarter than ours. What would the next 10 million years have looked like? This is the span of time over which evolutionary biologists feel most comfortable making specific predictions. Because 10 million years is long enough for significant change, but short enough that the continuity with the ancestral condition remains traceable. In the 10 million years following the hypothetical non-extinction, the troodontids would have continued to diversify across the world's landmasses. This is a confident prediction because it is simply the extrapolation of a trend already well established in the fossil record. Troodontids were already present on multiple continents in the late Cretaceous. Without the extinction to sweep them away, they would have continued spreading, adapting, filling available niches, and evolving regional variants specialized to local conditions. The question is not whether they would have diversified. The question is what forms that diversification might have taken. Some lineages would have remained relatively unchanged. Evolution does not demand that everything change at every moment. Animals in stable ecological niches with consistent selection pressures tend towards stasis, the maintenance of body forms and behaviors that are working adequately. The troodontid species that were hunting small prey in dense forests might have remained broadly similar to their Cretaceous ancestors for millions of years, fine-tuned but not fundamentally restructured. Ecological stability is a form of evolutionary conservatism. But other lineages, particularly those in regions where climate change or ecological disruption was creating new challenges and opportunities, would have come under more intense selection pressure. And in those lineages, the cognitive trajectory already established in the troodontid clade would likely have continued, because the conditions that drove it, the combination of a complex social environment a varied omnivorous diet, predator avoidance in the face of larger competitors, and nocturnal or crepuscular activity patterns demanding sophisticated sensory integration would still have been present. Here is where a specific and interesting prediction emerges. The Paleocene and Eocene periods, the time after the would-be extinction, were periods of global warming in the actual history of the Earth. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which occurred approximately 56 million years ago, was a period of rapid and extreme global warming caused by a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. In the actual history of the Earth, this event dramatically reshaped ecosystems, driving evolutionary change in the mammalian lineages that had inherited the post-extinction world. In a world where dinosaurs survived, this event would have happened regardless, because its causes were geological and atmospheric, independent of which animals were alive. And it would have stressed the dinosaurian ecosystems just as it stressed the mammalian ones in our actual history. Thermal stress creates exactly the conditions that favor behavioral flexibility. Animals that can adjust their behavior in response to changing conditions, that can shift their diets, alter their activity patterns, move to different habitats, and cooperate with others of their kind to find resources in a changing landscape, survive and reproduce when more behaviorally rigid animals fail. The thermal maximum would have been a selection event, and it would have selected, as such events tend to do, for cognitive versatility. The troodontid lineages that were already at the high end of cognitive sophistication would have had an advantage in this crisis that their less cognitively gifted relatives would not have. And the selective pressure of the crisis would have pushed their descendants further in the same direction. 10 million years in, somewhere in the warm, altered landscapes of what we might imagine as a Paleocene of living dinosaurs, a population of troodontid descendants is already larger brained than their Cretaceous ancestors. Perhaps slightly, perhaps significantly, depending on how intense the selection pressure of the thermal maximum was, and how well their cognitive flexibility served them through it. Their bodies are also changing, shaped by the New World rather than the Cretaceous one. In regions where forest cover has increased, some lineages have become more arboreal, spending significant time in the canopy, using their grasping hands and flexible wrists in ways the ground-dwelling ancestors rarely needed. Arboreal life, in the actual mammalian record, has been a powerful cognitive driver. Navigating three-dimensional space, judging distances, planning routes through complex branching structures, these demands scale with the complexity of the arboreal environment in ways that ground-level navigation does not. Imagine one of these animals at rest in the canopy, in the early morning of a world where the asteroid missed. It is about the size of a large cat. Its scales have not been replaced by feathers entirely, but many of the structures covering its body are more feather-like than scale-like, the ancestral condition of the troodontid lineage already trending in this direction due to the relationship between thermoregulation and extended behavioral activity. Its eyes are very large, dark, forward-facing, catching the first light that filters through the leaves in a way that no human eye could match. Its hands are resting on the branch it sits on, the fingers curled around the bark. And if you could watch those fingers for a while, you would notice something subtle and strange. They are not simply gripping, they are exploring, moving slightly along the surface of the bark, reading it in some way that serves no obvious immediate purpose, a behavior that biologists in the present-day world would recognize without difficulty. It is fidgeting. It is curious. It is attending to its environment in the idle, investigative way that highly cognitive animals attend to the world when they are not under immediate pressure to do anything else. That behavioral fingerprint, idle curiosity, exploration for its own sake, is one of the most reliable markers of advanced cognition, that behavioral ecologists know how to read. The question of sensory experience is one that deserves its own sustained attention, because the sensory world of an animal is not simply a backdrop to its intelligence. It is the medium in which intelligence operates, the raw material from which cognition builds its representations of the world. And the sensory world of the troodontid descendants would have been so different from ours that even if their cognitive sophistication had reached comparable levels, the content of their experience, what it would have been like to be one of them, in the way that the philosopher Thomas Nagel famously asked what it is like to be a bat, would have been profoundly alien. Begin with vision. We have already noted that Troodon had extraordinarily large eyes, likely adapted for low light conditions, with a resolving power that almost certainly exceeded our own. But the differences go deeper than acuity. The retinas of birds and many other non-mammalian vertebrates contain 4 types of photoreceptor cones, compared to the 3 types in human retinas. This 4th type of cone is sensitive to ultraviolet light, wavelengths that are completely invisible to human eyes. Many modern birds use ultraviolet sensitivity in mate selection, in foraging, and in territory marking, detecting patterns in plumage and plant material that are completely invisible to mammals. The troodontid lineage, as a theropod lineage with close affinities to the avian branch of the family tree, very likely retained tetrachromatic color vision, meaning they would have been seeing a visual world with a color dimension that does not exist for us. The flowers of the late Cretaceous, some of which were only just beginning to evolve ultraviolet reflecting patterns to attract insect pollinators, would have appeared to Troodon in a color richness that no human eye can access. The plumage of their own kind, which almost certainly included both visible spectrum and ultraviolet reflective elements, if the modern bird parallel holds, would have blazed with social information that we would have seen only as a partial and degraded shadow of what was really there. Now extend this visual richness over 66 million years of further evolution, in a lineage where visual processing is the dominant sensory modality, where the brain has been expanding partly in response to the demands of processing ever more sophisticated visual information, and where social and communicative life is being built on a visual foundation. The result would be a relationship with the visible world of extraordinary complexity and subtlety. Not just seeing more detail or seeing a broader spectrum, but having built cognitive and social structures on top of a visual substrate. So much richer than ours that the resulting experience of the world might be more different from ours than the experience of any animal whose mind we have ever tried to understand. In the world 20 million years after the non-extinction, in what corresponds approximately to the Eocene of the actual Earth, stand for a moment in a forest at the edge of a river valley, in what would become, in our actual world, East Asia. The light is the warm, diffuse light of an overcast Eocene afternoon. A small group of troodontid descendants is moving through the lower canopy of the trees. 5 adults and 2 juveniles. Foraging along a route they have used many times before, watch them move. They are larger than Troodon was, standing perhaps 1.5 meters at the hip, with longer arms than their ancestor and hands that move as they travel, touching bark and leaves in a way that is clearly exploratory, rather than simply supportive. Their heads move constantly, not in the jerky, reflexive way of a startled animal, but in the deliberate, scanning way of an animal that is processing a great deal of visual information and choosing what to attend to. They are talking to each other, not in the way that you talk, not with air force through a vocal tract in the rapid, modulated bursts that produce human speech. The vocal apparatus of a theropod dinosaur is configured differently from that of a mammal, and what these animals produce acoustically is a complex series of sounds with a character somewhere between the calls of modern birds and the lower frequency vocalizations of the largest living parrots. But they are also doing something with their bodies, with the orientation and movement of their hands, with the subtle shifts in the posture of their upper bodies, with what their eyes are doing. Their eyes, in particular, are communicatively active in a way that has no real parallel in the mammalian social repertoire. The pupil dilation and contraction, controlled voluntarily to a degree impossible in mammals, is part of the communicative signal. The direction and duration of gaze is meaningful in a richly differentiated way. They look at each other, and in that looking, they are exchanging information about what they are attending to, what they intend, what they're concerned about, in a visual vocabulary that has been building in complexity over millions of years. One of the adults has stopped at the base of a large tree and is examining something on the bark. A patch of fungus, distinctive in both its visible and its ultraviolet pattern, a species they know and seek out for its nutritional properties at this time of year. The adult vocalizes once, softly, a call of perhaps a half-second's duration with a specific internal structure, and two of the other adults immediately redirect their movement toward the tree. They know the call. They have heard its specific meaning many times before and in many contexts. It is not a simple alarm or a territorial marker. It is closer to what we would call a word, a communicative unit that reliably refers to a specific category of thing in the world. The juveniles, watching the adults, begin to move toward the tree as well, not because they responded to the call themselves, but because they are watching what the adults are doing and imitating it. They are learning. They are always learning in this period of their development when the brain is growing fastest and the connections between observation and action are being laid down most rapidly. This is how the knowledge moves from one generation to the next, not through genes, but through observation and imitation, and increasingly through something that is beginning to deserve the name instruction. 30 million years into the world without the extinction. This is roughly the distance in the past from which we stand today to the Oligocene epoch, a period of global cooling following the Eocene warmth, when the Antarctic ice sheet began to form and the world's ecosystems reorganized around new temperature regimes. In the actual history of the Earth, the Oligocene was the age of the archaic mammals, a world of strange, now extinct hoofed animals and early proboscideans and ancestral carnivores, all evolving rapidly to fill a world restructured by cooling. In the world we're imagining, those mammals are still small, still marginal, still largely nocturnal and insectivorous, still living in the cracks and margins of a dinosaur world. The reorganization happening in response to global cooling is a dinosaurian reorganization. The troodontid descendants, 30 million years on from the non-extinction, are not the animals that Troodon was. 30 million years is a span long enough to produce dramatic evolutionary change. In the actual mammalian record, 30 million years separates the early Eocene archaic mammals from the beginnings of the great ape lineage. 30 million years ago, in the actual past, our ancestors were already primates, already large-brained by mammalian standards, already living complex social lives in forest canopies. The pace of change that produces that kind of cognitive advancement in 30 million years is the pace we might reasonably apply to a lineage already more cognitively advanced than its competition, already under multiple converging selection pressures toward greater brain complexity. The troodontid descendants of this Oligocene equivalent are diverse and widespread. Some lineages have become specialists, adapting to the cooling world by reducing in size, becoming faster, tracking the shrinking warm zones. But other lineages have gone the other direction, and it is these lineages that matter most for the story. In the forests that persist in the subtropical and tropical latitudes, a population of troodontid descendants is now substantially larger than the Cretaceous Troodon. Body size in the vertebrate record tends to increase over evolutionary time in successful lineages. A pattern called Cope's rule, after the paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, who first described it in the 19th century. Larger bodies support larger absolute brain sizes, even when EQ remains constant. And in a lineage where EQ was itself increasing, larger bodies and larger EQ together mean dramatically larger absolute brains. The social structures of these animals have become genuinely complex. This is the most confident prediction evolutionary biology allows, because the social brain hypothesis predicts that once a lineage crosses certain cognitive thresholds, social complexity and cognitive complexity co-evolve in a mutually reinforcing way. More complex social groups require more sophisticated cognition to navigate. More sophisticated cognition enables more complex social behaviors, which create new selective pressures for even greater cognitive sophistication. It is a positive feedback loop, and once it starts, evolutionary biology does not know of a case in the vertebrate record where it simply stopped on its own without some external disruption. The social groups of the troodontid descendants in this world 30 million years on are not simple dominance hierarchies. They involve multiple interacting individuals with differentiated roles, ongoing relationships with histories that individuals track and remember across years, some form of communication more complex than simple alarm calls and threat displays, and the beginning, perhaps, of something that we would cautiously call culture. The transmission of learned behaviors from one individual to another across generations. Culture, in the biological sense, is not uniquely human. Modern crows and chimpanzees, and even some cetaceans demonstrate something that researchers are willing to call proto-cultural behavior, the social transmission of learned techniques that are not genetically encoded. In the troodontid descendants of this imagined world, 30 million years of enhanced social living and cognitive expansion would make proto-cultural behavior not just possible, but likely. What would that look like? Imagine a group of 8 or 10 of these animals in the forest canopy of what would be, in our history, somewhere in temperate North America or East Asia. They are not identical in behavior to one another. Individual differences, not just in body size or sex, but in what we might recognize as personality, in boldness versus caution, in the tendency to explore versus consolidate, are visible in their interactions. Some individuals are consistently first to investigate novel objects. Others are consistently the ones whose behavioral choices the rest of the group tends to follow. There is leadership of a kind, and it is not simply the dominance of the strongest or the largest. It tracks something more like demonstrated competence in specific situations. The individual who is best at locating food in a particular type of terrain. The individual whose alarm responses have the best track record of being accurate. This is the cognitive and social architecture from which something larger can grow. This is the substrate on which the next 20 or 30 million years of selection will work. And what that selection finds in this imagined world is something quite specific. Among a cognitively sophisticated social species under ongoing ecological pressure, any variation that enhances the ability to manipulate the physical environment, to make or modify objects, to use materials in the world to extend the body's capabilities, will be strongly favored. Because the ability to make tools is not primarily a physical ability, it is a cognitive one. It requires what researchers call causal reasoning, the ability to understand that one thing can be used to bring about a change in another thing. It requires planning, the projection of a desired future state, and the calculation of steps needed to reach it. It requires the fine motor control and hand-eye coordination to execute precise, learned physical operations. All of these are brain-intensive capabilities, and in a lineage where the brain has been expanding for tens of millions of years, these capabilities are within reach. One of the dimensions of this thought experiment that rarely gets the attention it deserves is the question of how the troodontid descendants would have experienced time. This sounds abstract, but it is actually a precise question in cognitive science, and the answer has significant implications for the kind of intelligence that might have evolved in the troodontid lineage. The experience of time, the sense of temporal flow, the ability to mentally travel backward to remembered events and forward to anticipated ones, is not a uniform property of animal cognition. It varies dramatically across species in ways that correspond to the cognitive sophistication of the animal. Simpler animals live almost entirely in the present, responding to immediate stimuli with stereotyped behaviors without meaningful representation of past or future. More sophisticated animals show increasing ability to represent the past in ways that inform current behavior, to anticipate future events, and to plan action sequences that unfold over extended timeframes. The capacity that cognitive scientists call episodic memory, the ability to mentally re-experience specific past events rather than simply responding to the learned associations they created, is one of the key markers of high cognitive sophistication. Episodic memory is well established in humans and has been demonstrated in experiments with several other species, including some corvids. In 2001, the researchers Nicola Clayton and Anthony Dickinson published a landmark study showing that western scrub jays, which are corvids closely related to jays and ravens, cache food in locations that other individuals have watched them use, and then relocate and move the cache when they later find themselves unobserved. What the scrub jays were demonstrating was an ability to represent a specific past event, being watched while caching in a way that informed a future action, re-caching when alone. This behavior requires something very like episodic memory, the re-experience of a specific observed episode rather than simply a conditioned response, and it implies the kind of temporal representation that was once thought to be uniquely human. The corvids that show this capability are the living heirs of the avian theropod lineage, the descendants of the branch of theropods that survived the Chicxulub impact, and they demonstrate temporal representation at some level 66 million years after the extinction. Their ancestors, in the world without the extinction, the troodontid lineage, would have had 66 million additional years to develop temporal representation under the same basic selection pressures that had already produced something like it in the corvid lineage. The capacity for rich temporal experience, for dwelling in remembered pasts and anticipated futures in ways that are more than simple conditioning, is a capacity that the troodontid lineage was already beginning to approach when the asteroid struck. In the world without the extinction, it would have had 6 times the span of the entire Cenozoic era to develop that capacity further. What would a rich temporal experience look like in a saurian nervous system? We cannot know the details, but we can note that the experience of time is intimately bound up with the experience of narrative, with the sense of self as an entity that persists through time, that has a past from which it has come, and a future toward which it is moving. Narrative is not a human invention in the deepest sense. It is what a sufficiently rich temporal memory produces when combined with a sufficiently sophisticated social environment. Stories, in their most basic form, are the representation of events as meaningful sequences, as things that happened for reasons and led to consequences. Any animal that can remember specific events, represent other individuals as entities with intentions and histories, and project the consequences of actions into an anticipated future, has the raw materials for something like narrative. The troodontid descendants, at some point in their 66 million years of additional development, would likely have crossed the threshold from temporal representation to something recognizable as narrative. And narrative, once it exists, is the substrate on which everything else that we call culture is built. The relationship between the troodontid descendants and the other animals of their world is also worth thinking about carefully. In the world without the extinction, the dinosaurian fauna would have continued to evolve, and the relationship between the cognitively sophisticated troodontid lineage and the rest of the fauna would have changed over time in ways that parallel, in some respects, the relationship between our own lineage and the animals around us. Early in the troodontid descendants' cognitive development, their relationship to other animals would have been primarily ecological. They hunted some, avoided others, competed with some for resources, and were largely indifferent to still others. This is the same relationship that Troodon had with the Cretaceous fauna, a relationship of predator and prey and competitor, governed by immediate ecological interest rather than any more complex consideration. But as cognitive sophistication increased, that relationship would have become more complex. Cognitively sophisticated animals tend to develop a more nuanced relationship with the animals around them. They begin to model the behavior of individual animals rather than simply responding to species-level cues. They develop the ability to predict individual behavior based on observed individual history. They may develop something like recognition of individual animals as distinct entities rather than interchangeable representatives of a category. Whether this leads to anything we would recognize as a moral relationship, a sense of obligation or responsibility toward other animals, If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Is an enormously complex question, but it is not an unanswerable one. In our own lineage, the development of something like moral consideration toward other animals has been a long and uneven process, still far from complete, and it has proceeded at a rate that tracks the development of cognitive sophistication rather than preceding it. A more cognitively sophisticated lineage with more time to develop might have arrived at a richer and more consistently applied version of this consideration, or it might have arrived at something completely different that does not map onto our moral categories at all. 50 million years into the world without the extinction. Half the span that separates us from the asteroid that did not miss. We are now in territory that corresponds, in the actual history of the Earth, to the Eocene, a time of extraordinary mammalian diversification in our world. But in this other world, the diversification belongs to the dinosaurs, and at its cognitive frontier, the troodontid descendants are approaching something that is genuinely difficult to name without loading the name with expectations that might be wrong. They are not human. They will never be human. This is the most important thing to hold on to as we approach the most speculative part of this exploration. Intelligence, when it evolves, does not follow a single template. The intelligence of a crow is not the intelligence of a dolphin. The intelligence of an octopus, whose nervous system is distributed so thoroughly through its arms that each arm can act semi-independently, is not the intelligence of a chimpanzee. The intelligence of a future troodontid descendant would be shaped by everything in the evolutionary history of the lineage that produced it. By a saurian nervous system architecture that is fundamentally different from the mammalian one. By the specific pressures and opportunities of its ecological history. By the sensory world it evolved to navigate. It would be intelligence in the sense of complex information processing, flexible behavioral response, social and cultural transmission of learned knowledge, and causal reasoning about the physical world. But it would not be our intelligence. It would be something genuinely other. One of the most important structural differences would likely be in how the brain itself is organized. Mammalian intelligence, including human intelligence, is concentrated in the neocortex, a 6-layered sheet of neural tissue that forms the outer surface of the cerebral hemispheres. The expansion of the neocortex, its massive elaboration over the past 50 to 60 million years of primate evolution, is the primary story of mammalian cognitive evolution. But saurian brains do not have a neocortex. The ancestors of birds and crocodilians and lizards diverged from the mammalian lineage over 300 million years ago, before the neocortex evolved, and their brains took a different structural path. Modern birds, which are the most cognitively sophisticated living dinosaurs, have achieved remarkable cognitive feats, including some that match or exceed mammalian performance in similar tasks, using a brain architecture that is organized quite differently from the mammalian one. The region of the avian brain most closely associated with complex cognition is called the nidopallium caudolaterale. And while it does not have the layered sheet structure of the mammalian neocortex, it accomplishes many of the same computational tasks through a different organizational logic. The troodontid descendants of our imagined world would be building on this saurian neural architecture, not on the mammalian one. Their intelligence would be organized differently at the cellular and circuit level, It might process certain types of information more efficiently than a mammalian brain of the same size, and other types less efficiently. Their visual processing, given the extraordinary investment in visual apparatus that the lineage had been making since at least the late Cretaceous, might be richer and more detailed than anything a mammalian brain achieves. Their temporal processing, the ability to track events across time, to maintain representations of past events and project them into anticipated futures, might be structured in ways that produce a different relationship to time than the one humans experience. These are not deficits, they are differences. An intelligence shaped by different architecture is not a lesser intelligence. It is a different one. And recognizing that difference is essential to thinking about this world honestly, rather than simply projecting ourselves into dinosaur bodies. What would the tools look like in the world 50 million years after the asteroid missed? The first tools would not look like human tools. The first tools used by our ancestors were simple, sharpened stones and bones and sticks, shaped by the minimal modification needed to make them useful. The first recognizable stone tools in the human record, the older one tradition attributed to early members of the genus Homo and possibly to earlier Australopithecines, appear in the fossil record around 2.6 million years ago, and consist of rocks with a few flakes knocked off to produce a sharp edge. They are simple objects, but they represent something cognitively enormous. The understanding that one thing in the world can be used to change another thing, and the planning and fine motor control needed to make that happen deliberately. Troodontid descendants with 60 million years of enhanced cognitive evolution behind them, and hands capable of more precise manipulation than any non-avian dinosaur that ever lived, would not start with older one-level tools at the 50 million year mark. They might have been using simple tools in the behavioral sense for millions of years already. The use of sticks or stones as simple implements, without modification, is documented in modern crows, chimpanzees, and a surprising range of other cognitively sophisticated animals. Behavioral tool use of this kind, the use of unmodified objects as extensions of the body, requires no technology, no manufacture, only the cognitive understanding that objects can be instrumentalized. The troodontid descendants of our imagined world, 50 million years on from their Cretaceous ancestors, would very likely have crossed this threshold tens of millions of years earlier. The 50 million year mark might see them engaging in behaviors more analogous to what we observe in advanced chimpanzee populations, deliberate and culturally transmitted tool manufacture using multiple components. The selection and transportation of suitable raw materials across significant distances. The teaching of tool-making techniques from experienced individuals to younger ones. The forests of this imagined Eocene equivalent ring with sounds that are neither bird call nor mammal call, but something in between and unlike either. Vocalizations from social groups of troodontid descendants carry more information than simple alarm calls or territorial declarations. The structure of the calls is complex, with elements that vary in ways that correlate with context, with the identity of the caller, with what the caller is attending to. Other members of the group respond differentially to these vocalizations, in ways that suggest they are extracting information from them rather than simply reacting to their presence. This is not language, but it is not language either. It is something on the continuum that language requires. The use of structured sound to convey specific meaning between individuals who share a communicative system. And 50 million years of selection pressure has had time to push that communicative system considerably further than anything a chimpanzee or crow achieves today. This is where the story deepens in a way that the simple question of intelligence cannot quite contain. Because the evolution of intelligence, in every lineage we know well, is inseparable from the evolution of communication. And the evolution of complex communication is inseparable from the evolution of something that has no single clean name in science, but that philosophers and linguists and cognitive scientists have been circling around for a long time. The ability to represent one thing as another. The ability to make a symbol. Symbolism is the cognitive operation at the heart of language, art, ritual, mathematics, and everything else that we associate with the most distinctively human forms of intelligence. A symbol is something that stands for something else. A sound that refers to an object that is not present. A mark that represents an event that has already passed. A gesture that communicates an internal state. When an animal moves from signals, which are tied directly to the thing they communicate about, to symbols, which are arbitrary and conventional and must be learned by all members of the communicating community, something fundamental has changed. The cognitive world of that animal has expanded to include not just the physical present, but a represented past and anticipated future, a mental world that extends far beyond the immediate perceptual environment. We do not know exactly when, in human evolution, the symbolic threshold was crossed. The evidence from the archaeological record is genuinely contested. Red ochre with apparent engraved patterns appears at Blombos Cave in South Africa around 77,000 years ago, and some researchers argue for evidence of symbolic behavior much earlier. Clearly, symbolic behavior, including deliberate burial with grave goods, personal ornaments, and representational art, is unambiguously present in the record by 40 to 50,000 years ago. The cognitive architecture for symbolism appears to have been built up over a very long period, with different components emerging at different times in the human lineage. In the troodontid descendants of the world without the extinction, a similar long period buildup would have been underway, shaped by the specific saurian cognitive architecture rather than the mammalian one. At the 60 million year mark, 6 million years beyond the point at which Homo sapiens appears in the actual fossil record, the question is not whether symbolic communication has emerged, but what form it has taken in an animal whose primary sensory world is so dominated by vision that its relationship to visual information is fundamentally more sophisticated than ours. Consider what vision means for an animal with eyes of the size and resolving power we have been attributing to the troodontid descendants. Humans are visually oriented primates by vertebrate standards, but even human vision, excellent as it is among mammals, is not in the same class as the vision of many birds. A common buzzard can resolve detail at approximately 8 times the distance a human can. A peregrine falcon can track a small moving target from a distance of over 1 kilometer. The visual world of a cognitively sophisticated animal with this level of visual acuity is not simply our visual world rendered in higher resolution. It is a qualitatively different experience of the environment, one in which vastly more visual information is available, processed, and remembered. An animal with this visual relationship to the world, when it begins to represent the world symbolically, would likely begin with visual representations. The first marks that might be called art in the troodontid tradition would not necessarily be the handprints and simple animal outlines of the earliest human cave art. They might be something more visually complex, more detailed, reflecting a visual processing capacity that exceeds our own. They might also be made with different materials and in different contexts, shaped by the ecological and behavioral history of the lineage rather than our own. The story of the first troodontid art is one we cannot tell in detail, because the details depend on specificities of body, environment, and social practice that are genuinely beyond our ability to predict. But the general trajectory, from complex social communication to symbolic representation, is one that evolutionary biology gives us reasonable grounds to expect. The 60 million year mark is also the point at which we should begin to think about what might be called the ecological footprint of the troodontid descendants. Intelligence, in the history of our own lineage, has always been associated with an expanding ecological impact. More intelligent animals tend to be more effective at modifying their environments to suit their needs. They range more widely, exploit resources more completely, outcompete less cognitively sophisticated species more effectively. This is not inevitable. Intelligence does not always lead to environmental dominance, but in a lineage where intelligence and tool use and social coordination are all co-evolving, the tendency is toward increasing environmental impact. The troodontid descendants of the world without the extinction, at the 60 million year mark, would have been shaping their environments in ways that exceeded anything Troodon itself was capable of. Perhaps they were managing forest resources, returning repeatedly to productive areas, possibly even engaging in the very early stages of something like habitat modification, clearing vegetation, improving access to water, activities that benefit the group without constituting agriculture in any sense, but that represent a relationship with the landscape that is more active and more managed than pure forager behavior. The line between intensive foraging and incipient cultivation is fuzzy even in the human record. The troodontid descendants might have been approaching that fuzzy line long before anything recognizable as deliberate agriculture appeared. What were the other animals of this world doing in the meantime? The dinosaurian ecosystem of the world without the extinction did not consist only of troodontids. These ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, continued in their roles as large herbivores. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, filled the mid-sized herbivore niches. The ankylosaurs, armored and low-browsing, continued in their heavily defended grazing roles. The sauropods, enormously reduced in diversity compared to the Jurassic but still present in the late Cretaceous, maintained a presence in the largest herbivore niche. And the tyrannosaurs, the apex predators of Laramidia, continued to reign at the top of the food chain in North America, evolving into new species as environments shifted, but maintaining their basic ecological role. All of these animals had their own evolutionary futures in the world without the extinction. Some would have diversified and flourished, others might have declined as climates changed and the world reorganized, but none of them were on the cognitive trajectory that the troodontid descendants were following. The ceratopsians and hadrosaurs and sauropods were ecological players with important roles, but their brains were not heading toward the kind of runaway encephalization that was ongoing in the troodontid lineage. The most interesting evolutionary story in this world was, and remained, the one being written in the skulls of the troodontid descendants. Quietly, across millions of years, in forest canopies and rocky hillsides and the margins of rivers, something was becoming. There is a specific question that the evolutionary biologists who engage with this thought experiment return to again and again, because it is the question that most directly tests the limits of what we can confidently predict versus what we are simply projecting. That question is whether the troodontid descendants would have developed anything analogous to agriculture. And the reason this question is so interesting is that agriculture, in the human record, is not simply a technology. It is a relationship with time, with the land, with other species, and with the future that represents a fundamental reorganization of how an intelligent species exists in its environment. Agriculture in the human world arose independently in at least 11 different regions, including the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River regions of China, the highlands of New Guinea, Mesoamerica, and the South-Central Andes, among others. This independent parallel origin is exactly the kind of evidence that the convergent school of evolutionary biology points to when arguing that certain adaptations are not accidental, but are reliably produced by certain conditions. When the conditions are right, agriculture tends to emerge. The relevant conditions in the human case include a sufficiently large and cognitively sophisticated population, a sufficiently rich environment containing species amenable to domestication, and a resource pressure sufficient to make the enormous initial investment in agricultural development worthwhile. These conditions are not unique to humans. They are conditions that any sufficiently cognitively sophisticated species, embedded in a biologically rich environment, might eventually face and eventually respond to in similar ways. The troodontid descendants, in the world without the extinction, would have faced versions of these conditions at some point in their long history. The specific crops and animals that we humans domesticated would not have been available to them, because those plants and animals are themselves the products of the post-extinction world, and would not exist in the same forms in a world where the extinction did not happen. But the principle of managed relationships with other species, of investing effort in the reliable production of food rather than purely extracting it from the wild, would have been available as a cognitive and behavioral strategy. Whether and when the troodontid descendants would have pursued it depends on ecological pressures and cognitive capabilities that we cannot precisely specify. But the conditions for it would eventually have been present in some regions, and an intelligent lineage with enough time would likely have found it. The resulting agriculture would not have looked like ours. The species domesticated would be completely different. The methods developed would reflect a saurian nervous system's relationship to the problems of growing and managing food, which might be very different from the mammalian approach. But the fundamental logic, managing the environment to produce reliable nutrition, would be the same. And with agriculture comes sedentism, permanent or semi-permanent settlement, and with sedentism comes the possibility of accumulating wealth and complexity in ways that nomadic foraging does not easily allow. The trajectory from foraging to agriculture to settled civilization that we followed in the past 10,000 years would not necessarily have been slower or faster in the troodontid lineage, but given that they had tens of millions of years of additional cognitive development before reaching this transition, the cognitive prerequisites would have been far more fully developed when they arrived there. Whatever they built on the foundation of agriculture would have been built by minds that had been preparing for the project, in some sense, for much longer than we had. The physical environment of the world without the extinction is another dimension worth attending to carefully. In the actual history of the Earth, the 66 million years since the extinction have been a period of dramatic geological and climatic change. The continents have continued to move, driven by plate tectonics, and the configuration of the land masses today is significantly different from the late Cretaceous configuration. The Tethys Sea, a large body of water that separated Europe and Asia from Africa and India in the Cretaceous, has largely closed. India has collided with Asia, raising the Himalayas. The Atlantic Ocean has widened. Antarctica has moved to the pole and acquired its ice sheet. The Isthmus of Panama has formed, connecting North and South America and shutting off the exchange of water between the Atlantic and Pacific. All of these geological changes would have happened in the world without the extinction too, because they are driven by processes in the Earth's mantle and crust that are independent of what animals are alive on the surface. The physical world available to the troodontid descendants, in the 66 million years of their additional history, would have been a world undergoing the same basic geological transformations as the world we actually live in. This matters because geological change creates both challenges and opportunities for evolving lineages. The formation of the Himalayas changed the climate of Asia, creating the monsoon system and the rain shadows that shaped the ecology of the entire region. The closure of the Tethys Sea changed ocean circulation patterns with global climatic consequences. The glaciation of Antarctica initiated the long cooling trend that produced the ice ages of the past 2 to 3 million years. All of these events would have forced the troodontid descendants to adapt, to move, to diversify in response to changing environments. An adaptation under pressure tends to accelerate cognitive evolution, just as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum would have done earlier in their history. Each major environmental perturbation would have been a selection event that favored the most behaviorally flexible individuals, the most cognitively versatile populations. Over 66 million years of such events, the accumulation of cognitive development would have been substantial. It is also worth noting that the world without the extinction would not have been a world without major extinction events altogether. The fossil record of the actual Cenozoic contains multiple significant extinction events, though none as dramatic as the end Cretaceous. The end Eocene extinction event, around 34 million years ago, drove significant mammalian lineages to extinction in the actual history of the Earth. The Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, which occurred between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, eliminated the great majority of large land animals on every continent. Some of these extinctions were likely driven by climate change. Others may have had a human contribution. In the world without the extinction, similar events would have occurred, and the troodontid descendants would have been affected by them, and would in some cases have been responsible for them, just as our lineage has been responsible for the Pleistocene extinctions that emptied the world of its great beasts. An intelligent lineage with a large ecological footprint in a world full of large dinosaurian herbivores and predators would have been a powerful ecological force. The troodontid descendants, as their cognitive and technological sophistication increased, would have had increasing capacity to affect the ecosystems around them, just as we have affected ours. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Some of the great dinosaurian herbivores might have been hunted to local extinction by troodontid hunters in the same way that human hunters in the actual Pleistocene contributed to the extinction of the woolly mammoth and the giant ground sloth. The world of 66 million years of troodontid influence would bear the marks of that influence, just as our world bears the marks of ours in what is absent as much as in what is present. In the world that actually happened, the moment that separates pre-human hominins from anatomically modern Homo sapiens, the moment when the cognitive and social and technological trajectory of our lineage crossed some threshold and produced a species capable of building civilizations, is the subject of enormous debate among paleoanthropologists and archaeologists. Some place the key transition around 300,000 years ago, when fossil evidence of anatomically modern humans first appears. Others argue for a more behavioral revolution around 50,000 years ago, the so-called Upper Paleolithic transition, when the archaeological record begins to show an explosion of symbolic behavior, long-distance trade networks, and technological innovation that has no real precedent in the preceding record. The truth is probably not a single moment, but a long, gradual process, with key threshold crossings scattered across hundreds of thousands of years, each one building on the last. For the troodontid descendants, the equivalent threshold crossings would be distributed across a much longer time frame, but following a similar logic. And at the 66 million year mark, the point in the hypothetical world that corresponds to right now in the actual one, we should be thinking not about whether those thresholds have been crossed, but about what the world on the far side of those thresholds looks like, for an intelligence shaped so differently from our own. That is the question we have been building toward, and it is the hardest one to answer honestly. Because at 66 million years of additional evolution, working from a starting point that was already approaching our own level of cognitive sophistication in some measures, the troodontid descendants would be so far beyond what they were at the starting point that almost any specific prediction becomes unanchored from the evidence base. What we can do is think about the constraints and the likely shape of what intelligence, in any form, tends to do with time. One of the things intelligence does, across every lineage we know well, is accumulate. The accumulation of learned knowledge, of cultural and technological development, tends to proceed not linearly, but exponentially, because each generation starts from where the last one left off. Human technological change was essentially imperceptibly slow for the first 2 million years of our tool-using history, and then began to accelerate, and continues to accelerate. The agricultural revolution, 10,000 years ago, built on 2 million years of foraging knowledge and cognitive development. The Industrial Revolution, 250 years ago, built on 10,000 years of agricultural civilization. The Digital Revolution, 70 years ago, built on 250 years of industrialization. Each transition is faster than the last, because each one has more accumulated knowledge to build on. This accelerating accumulation is not a specifically human phenomenon. It is a property of any sufficiently complex cultural system that transmits learned knowledge between generations faster than it is lost. An intelligence that had been accumulating knowledge and technology for 66 million years even at much slower rates than our own, would have arrived at something that our conceptual vocabulary has no words for. Not because it is necessarily more intelligent in some abstract sense, not because intelligence has a single dimension along which more or less can be straightforwardly measured, but because 66 million years is a time frame that dwarfs the entirety of our own species' existence by a factor of over 200. We have existed as a species for roughly 300,000 years. We have had writing for 5,000. We have had science in the modern sense for 400. The troodontid descendants have been building on 66 million years of accumulated cultural and technological development. Whatever that produces is beyond our ability to imagine with any confidence. We can name some of its probable properties: highly organized, complex, likely stable in ways that our own civilization is not yet stable. But the specifics are beyond us. Here is something worth sitting with. The fact that we do not know what the troodontid world would look like at 66 million years is not a failure of the imagination. It is the most accurate thing this exploration can tell you. If you could travel to that world and look at what the troodontid descendants had become, you would likely not recognize it as the product of the evolutionary trajectory we have been tracing. You might not even recognize it as intelligence at first. Because intelligence, when it has had 66 million years to work with, would not necessarily look like anything we have ever encountered or imagined. It would look like whatever it had become, shaped by its own history and its own logic and its own relationship with the world, in ways that are genuinely beyond projection. This is humbling, and it is supposed to be. The whole point of this thought experiment, the reason it is worth taking seriously as a scientific and philosophical exercise, rather than dismissing as mere speculation, is precisely that it forces us to confront the contingency of our own existence and the scope of what intelligence can become when given time. We are here, in this world, in this moment, because a rock hit a planet 66 million years ago. That is the full, unadorned truth of the matter. The event that cleared the ecological space in which the mammalian lineage exploded into diversity, eventually producing the primates, eventually producing the great apes, eventually producing the genus Homo and the species Sapiens, was a random cosmological event with no particular design behind it, and no preference for the outcome it produced. We were not the intended result. We were not the inevitable result. We were one result, of one trajectory, of one sequence of events that might easily have been otherwise. The asteroid did not miss. The Chicxulub impactor struck the Yucatan at the angle and velocity and size that it had, and 75% of life on Earth went with it, and the troodontid lineage went with it, and the world that might have been closed before it could fully open. What we are left with is the fossil record of that lost trajectory, the bones and brain cases of Troodon and its relatives, the endocast that preserved the ghost of a brain that was doing something remarkable and was interrupted before we could find out what it was heading toward. Dale Russell, when he built his Dinosauroid model in the 1980s, was criticized by many of his colleagues for anthropomorphism, for projecting a humanoid body plan onto an animal whose evolutionary trajectory might not have produced one. That criticism was largely valid in its specific form. The body plan of the troodontid descendants would not necessarily have converged on anything like the human body plan. Evolution is not teleological. It does not aim at a target. It responds to selection pressures, and the selection pressures acting on a saurian lineage in a dinosaur-dominated world would have been different in important ways from the ones that shaped the human body plan. The hands of the troodontid descendants would not have the thumb arrangement of a human hand. Their feet would retain the basic theropod digitigrade structure, walking on the toes rather than the flat of the foot. Their heads would not be the round, foreshortened, large craniumed heads of humans, but something shaped by 66 million years of saurian developmental logic, different in ways we cannot fully specify. But the criticism of anthropomorphism should not be confused with the dismissal of the underlying question. The underlying question is real. It is scientifically serious. And it is one of the most profound questions in evolutionary biology. Is intelligence a convergent outcome? Is it something that life tends toward, given time and the right conditions? Or is it so contingent on the specific history of the lineage that produced it that it is essentially a one-time accident? The troodontid lineage is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the debate about that question, because it represents a genuinely independent trajectory toward high cognitive complexity, not something produced by the primate lineage or influenced by it, but a separate experiment in encephalization that was running in parallel and was interrupted before we could see where it went. The current scientific consensus, to the extent there is one, leans toward the view that intelligence is at least partially convergent, that the conditions that produce it, ecological complexity, long developmental periods, social living, omnivory, a competitive environment that rewards behavioral flexibility, reliably tend to produce cognitive expansion when they persist for long enough. This view is supported by the multiple independent origins of high cognitive sophistication in the animal kingdom. The primates, the cetaceans, the corvids, the elephants, the octopuses, all of whom have arrived at sophisticated problem-solving, tool use, complex social cognition, and in some cases something approaching symbolic communication, from completely different starting points and through completely different neural architectures. Intelligence, in this view, is something the biosphere reaches for, not always, not inevitably, but with a regularity that suggests it is more than a fluke. If that is right, then the troodontid lineage was reaching for it. And if the asteroid had missed, the question is not whether intelligence would have appeared on Earth. We know intelligence appeared on Earth because we are here. The question is whether there would have been two independent experiments in high intelligence on the same planet at the same time, and what that would have meant. In the actual history of the Earth, the two most cognitively sophisticated lineages alive today are us, the great apes and specifically Homo sapiens, and the corvids and parrots among the birds. The birds are the living dinosaurs, the descendants of the avian theropod lineage that survived the Chicxulub impact, precisely because they were small and could find food in the disrupted post-impact environment. Modern birds, including the cognitively extraordinary corvids, represent what one branch of the theropod family tree managed to preserve and develop through and after the extinction. In a sense, the birds are the echo of the troodontid potential, a distant and much attenuated echo, shaped by 66 million years of different selection pressures, but carrying the genetic and developmental heritage of the same remarkable clade. When you watch a crow solving a multi-step puzzle to retrieve a piece of food, when you see a New Caledonian crow making and using a hooked tool from a material it has never encountered before, when you hear a raven apparently communicating something specific and non-stereotyped to its partner, you are seeing the residue of something that was building in the theropod lineage for a very long time before the extinction. You are seeing what survived. And what survived, even reduced and redirected by 66 million years of different ecological pressures, is still remarkable enough to astonish researchers who study it. The crow sitting on your fence, watching you with those bright, measuring eyes, is doing something with its brain that no other bird and very few mammals can match. That intelligence has deep roots, and those roots go back to the Cretaceous. There is a school of thought in evolutionary biology, most forcefully articulated by the paleontologist and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, that emphasizes the radical contingency of evolution. The idea that if you could rewind the tape of life and play it again, the outcome would be completely different. That intelligence and complexity are not tendencies of the biosphere, but accidents, and that the emergence of beings like us on this planet was so improbable that it is essentially unrepeatable. Gould called this view, in its most developed form, the argument for the radical contingency of evolutionary history, and it was enormously influential in shaping how evolutionary biologists thought about the directionality of evolution in the late 20th century. The opposing view, most powerfully articulated by the Cambridge paleontologist Simon Conway Morris, argues for what he calls evolutionary convergence, the idea that life repeatedly and independently finds the same solutions to the same ecological and physical problems, and that intelligence is one of those solutions, something that the right conditions reliably produce. Conway Morris and others in the convergent school point to the extraordinary frequency with which apparently similar cognitive capabilities have evolved independently in mammals and birds and cephalopods, despite their enormously different nervous system architectures, as evidence that intelligence is not a fluke, but a robust evolutionary attractor, something that selection reliably finds when the conditions are right. The debate between these positions is not fully resolved, but the evidence from the troodontid lineage, from the convergent evolution of bird intelligence following the extinction, and from the multiple, independent origins of sophisticated cognition across the animal kingdom leans toward the Conway-Morris position on the specific question of intelligence. The conditions that produce intelligence seem to be the conditions that life produces when ecosystems are complex and competitive and animals have time to specialize. And those conditions arise frequently enough that intelligence, once the right nervous system complexity is achieved, tends to emerge. This matters to our thought experiment in a specific and important way. It suggests that the question was not whether intelligence would eventually appear in the world without the extinction. The troodontid lineage was already well on its way. The question is whether that intelligence would have discovered us, or something like us, before we could discover it. Because this is the most disorienting aspect of the alternative world we have been imagining. In the world where the asteroid missed, there are no humans. There are no primates beyond the small, marginal nocturnal forms that would have been kept in check by dinosaurian ecological dominance. There is no paleoanthropology because there are no hominins to study. There is no history in the human sense because there is no writing, because there are no humans to develop writing. All of the things that define the world as we know it, agriculture and cities and science and art and music and language and mathematics, all of it either does not exist or exists in some form we could not recognize, produced by a lineage with a completely different evolutionary history and a completely different relationship to the world. And yet the world is not empty of mind. In the forests and the mountains and the river valleys of a planet that has had 66 million more years to develop its dominant intelligent lineage, something is present that would recognize us as something like itself, perhaps. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the cognitive gulf between a mind that has had 66 million more years of development and a mind that has had 300,000 years is too great for recognition to flow in both directions. Perhaps to the troodontid descendants, we would be approximately what a crow is to us, clearly cognitively sophisticated by some measure, interesting to observe, recognizable as a kind of mind, but operating at a level of complexity so far below their own that meaningful communication in any deep sense would be essentially impossible. This reversal is the most unsettling aspect of the thought experiment. We are accustomed, in our actual world, to being the most cognitively sophisticated thing present. Our closest competitors, the great apes and the dolphins and the corvids, are genuinely impressive, but they are not in our league by any measurable cognitive standard. We are alone at the top. And being alone at the top shapes everything about how we think about intelligence, about what it means, about what it is for. We have never had to contemplate the experience of being the less intelligent party in a relationship with another mind on the same planet. We have never had to think about what it would mean to be recognized, evaluated, and perhaps managed by an intelligence that exceeds our own. But in the world without the extinction, that would be the situation in which a hypothetical human equivalent might find itself. If a human equivalent could even arise in such a world. And it is a situation that is genuinely difficult to think about clearly, because all of our intuitions about intelligence and cognition and what it means to be a mind in the world are shaped by our actual experience of being the apex cognitive entity on this planet. Strip that experience away, and we are in unfamiliar territory in the deepest possible sense. There is something else worth considering, something that the evolutionary biologists who discuss this thought experiment rarely pause on, but that seems to me to be one of its most important dimensions. We tend to frame the question of what the troodontid descendants would have become in purely cognitive and technological terms. Would they have built cities? Would they have developed agriculture? Would they have created art? These are natural questions, shaped by the framework of our own historical development. But they may be the wrong questions, or at least incomplete ones. Because the other thing that intelligence does, in the history of the lineage that we know best, is develop a relationship with the world that is shaped by more than pure cognitive sophistication. The human relationship with the natural world, with other species, with the larger web of life, is not simply a product of our intelligence. It is also a product of our evolutionary history, our primate ancestry, our long experience as social animals embedded in ecosystems that we depended on and were part of. The specific sensory world of the human animal, what we find beautiful, what we find frightening, what we are instinctively drawn toward and what we instinctively avoid, is deeply shaped by our primate past, by the forests in which our ancestors evolved, by the threats and opportunities of an African savanna that shaped our perceptions over millions of years. The troodontid descendants would have a completely different evolutionary history behind them. Their version of beauty, if they had one, would be shaped by the Cretaceous forests and the sensory world of a large-eyed nocturnal hunter. Their instincts and their aesthetic responses, to whatever degree those concepts apply, would have been forged in a saurian nervous system navigating a dinosaurian world. They would experience the same planet we inhabit differently, not just cognitively but perceptually, emotionally in some functional sense, in terms of what the world means to a nervous system shaped by their particular history rather than ours. This difference is not a deficiency on either side. It is simply the reality of what evolution produces. Animals shaped by their histories, perceiving and valuing the world through the lens of those histories. And in the world without the extinction, the dominant intelligence on the planet would have been shaped by a history 66 million years longer and structurally different from ours in almost every way. Their relationship to the world, their version of meaning and significance and value, would be something genuinely alien to us. Not because aliens in the science fiction sense are what they are, but because genuinely alien means genuinely shaped by a different origin, and a different origin is exactly what they would have. The fossil record of the Cretaceous gives us something rare and precious. It gives us a second data point. In the history of intelligence on this planet, we normally have only one data point: ourselves. One experiment in high cognitive complexity. One lineage that made it all the way to technological civilization. One set of answers to the questions that intelligence asks about the world. Troodon gives us a glimpse of a second experiment. Incomplete and interrupted, but real. Real enough to measure, real enough to extrapolate from. Real enough to use as a check on our assumption that the path to intelligence that we followed was the only path, or the inevitable path, or in some deeper sense, the right path. The existence of Troodon, and the trajectory it represents, tells us that intelligence is not a human invention. It is not something that our lineage discovered in the African savanna and brought into a world that had never seen it before. Intelligence was being invented, independently and separately, in the lineage that produced Troodon, in the theropod dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous, before our lineage had done anything particularly remarkable. It was being invented in a saurian body by a saurian brain using saurian sensory apparatus in a world full of dinosaurs. And if the asteroid had missed, that invention would have had 66 million more years to develop. What it would have become, we genuinely cannot say, but that it would have become something is, given what we know about the trajectory it was already on, very difficult to doubt. This is the thing that makes Troodon so unsettling, so genuinely strange as a fossil. When you look at it without the comfortable assumption that dinosaurs were just big reptiles with small brains who were appropriately replaced by the superior mammals, that comfortable assumption is wrong. Not in every respect, not for every dinosaur, but for the troodontid lineage, it is demonstrably, measurably wrong. The troodontids were not appropriately replaced by superior competitors. They were interrupted. They were cut short. They were part of a mass extinction that took with them not just individual species, but an entire cognitive trajectory that we will never know the end of. The rock hit, the trajectory ended, and the mammals inherited the world, and one of them eventually became us. And we sit here now, 66 million years after the moment that made us possible, and we hold the skull of Troodon formosus in our hands, or we stare at photographs of it in the light of screens, and we do the thing that only intelligence can do. We ask the question, what if? We follow the logic. We run the calculation. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. We imagine the world that almost was, and in doing so, we do something that the fossil record of Troodon suggests was just beginning to be possible in that lineage 66 million years ago. In that small, large-eyed, large-brained, quick-fingered hunter moving through the Cretaceous dark. We use intelligence to contemplate the nature and the contingency of intelligence itself. The Troodons were just beginning to be able to do this, if they were doing it at all. We have been doing it for a while now, and the difference between those two positions, everything that separates us from where they were when the rock hit, is everything that 66 million years of additional evolution might have given them, if only the sky had been clear. There is a final question that this thought experiment opens, one that sits at the intersection of science and philosophy, and that does not admit of a clean answer, but that is worth holding in mind as we come to the end of this journey. The question is, what the existence of the troodontid lineage and the trajectory it was on tells us about the nature of intelligence as a phenomenon in the universe. We tend to think of intelligence as something that emerged once, in one lineage, through one sequence of events, on one planet, our intelligence. We tend to treat it as exceptional, as the pinnacle of what the 4 billion year history of life on Earth was building toward. And our intelligence is remarkable, that is not in question. But the troodontid lineage tells us that the appearance of high cognitive complexity in the history of life on this planet was not a singular event. It was at least a doubly attempted phenomenon, emerging independently in two lineages on the same planet within the same span of Earth history. One attempt succeeded, at least in the sense of continuing to develop over the following 66 million years. The other was interrupted at a stage that, while less developed than modern human intelligence in some respects, was nonetheless genuinely and measurably extraordinary by any reasonable biological standard. If intelligence can emerge twice independently on a single planet, what does that imply about how frequently it might emerge across the universe? This is not a question that paleontology alone can answer. It belongs to a broader conversation about the origins of life, the conditions that produce cognitive complexity, the frequency with which those conditions arise on other worlds, and the timescales over which intelligent lineages might develop. But the troodontid lineage is a data point in that conversation, one that has not always been given its proper weight. If the conditions that produce intelligence on Earth are such that, even without the mammals, even without the primate lineage, even without the specific evolutionary history that produced us, an independent intelligent lineage was already developing, then the conditions for intelligence may be less restrictive than we sometimes assume. The biosphere may reach toward mind more readily and more frequently than a single example would suggest. This is not a settled question. It is an open one, and it will remain open until we know more about other planets, about the limits of cognitive evolution, about the specific mechanisms by which intelligence emerges from biological complexity. But the fossil of Troodon formosus, sitting in a museum tray somewhere in the world, Its enormous orbital cavity staring at the ceiling of a collections room is part of the evidence we have. It is a fragment of a story we interrupted before it could finish. And the wisest thing we can do with it, the most honest and most scientifically serious response to what it represents, is simply to hold the question open, to resist the easy comfort of thinking we were inevitable, to sit with the strange and vertiginous recognition that intelligence on this planet was tried more than once, and that the version that succeeded was not the only one that was trying. It is also worth noting, before we leave this thought experiment behind, that the question of what Troodon was heading toward is not entirely separate from the question of what we are heading toward. We stand in the actual world at a point in the history of intelligence on this planet where the pace of change is faster than it has ever been, where the tools we are building are themselves becoming cognitively sophisticated in ways that were unimaginable even a few decades ago. We do not know where that trajectory leads. We know it from the inside, which makes it harder to see clearly, not easier. The troodontid lineage, viewed from the outside, from the distance of 66 million years, and the perspective of the species that replaced it, is a reminder that trajectories can end, that what is building towards something remarkable can be interrupted before it arrives, that the future for any lineage of any intelligence is never guaranteed. It is only ever a direction shaped by the present, vulnerable to the contingencies of a universe that has no particular investment in any outcome. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you have been thinking for a long time about deep time. It is not the quiet of having no more questions. It is the quiet of having fully felt the weight of the questions you do have. And the question of Troodon, properly felt, is one of the heaviest weights in the entire body of knowledge about the history of life. We tend to think of the past as fixed, as settled, as the pile of things that already happened and therefore cannot be otherwise. And in the most literal sense, that is true. The asteroid struck. The extinction happened. The troodontid lineage ended. These are facts, and facts are not arguable. But the contingency of those facts, the narrowness of the margin between the world we have and the world we might have had, that is not settled. That does not close. Every time you look at the fossil of a Troodon, every time you see those enormous orbital cavities and read the numbers on the encephalization quotient, the margin opens again. The almost reopens. These 66 million years of history that did not happen become present in a way that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. We are the beneficiaries of a catastrophe, not in any comfortable or triumphalist sense. The Chicxulub impact killed something like 3/4 of all species on Earth. It was one of the most devastating events in the 4 billion year history of life. A wound in the fabric of a living complexity that took tens of millions of years to partially heal. We are not celebrating it. We are simply acknowledging that our existence, the existence of every human being who has ever lived, every culture and civilization and language and song and theorem and painting and story that has ever been made, depends on it. Remove the impact, and we are not improved or diminished. We simply are not. The space in which we exist was created by the catastrophe, and without the catastrophe, the space is not there to be filled. This is worth sitting with, very quietly, in the dark. The thought that the whole of human experience, everything you have ever felt or known or remembered, every conversation, every ordinary Tuesday, every person you have ever loved, exists because a specific piece of rock was in a specific place in space 66 million years ago. The scale of the contingency is vertiginous. It makes the mind reach for something solid to hold onto. And the solid thing that is available, the most honest response to that vertigo, is simply to keep looking at the evidence, to keep asking the questions, to keep following the implications wherever they lead, as carefully and as honestly as we can. The fossil record of the troodontid lineage is telling us something that we are only beginning to fully hear. It is telling us that intelligence did not wait for us. It is telling us that the biosphere, given enough time and enough ecological complexity, reaches toward mind, and that the mind it reached toward in the Cretaceous was not our mind, but something that might have become just as real and just as strange and just as particular as our own. It is telling us that the universe is larger in terms of possible outcomes than our single example of intelligent life would suggest, and smaller in terms of how close we came to not being the example that survived. The Two Medicine Formation in Montana, where many of the most important Troodon specimens were found, is a place you can visit. The rock there is a warm tan and orange, eroded into badlands that stretch to the horizon, under a sky that in summer is achingly blue. The Cretaceous landscape that Troodon moved through is long gone, replaced first by the grasslands that came with the mammals, and then by the agriculture that came with us. The land has been human land for a very long time now, used and shaped by people whose own deep history goes back further in this place than the European settlers who named and mapped it. Walking in the Two Medicine Badlands, you walk on rock that was once the floor of a forest, where something with large eyes and grasping hands and a brain that weighed more, relative to its body, than almost any animal before it, moved through the Cretaceous dark. You walk where it walked. You are the intelligence that survived, the one that is left, the one that, by the narrowest of cosmological margins, got to be here at all. Sleep comes easier sometimes when the sense of contingency settles into something like gratitude. Not gratitude to anyone in particular, not gratitude to the universe which has no preferences and no intentions, but a simpler and quieter thing. The recognition that being here, being a mind in the world, being the kind of thing that can ask the question what if, is not guaranteed. It was not certain. It was not the inevitable product of some grand design. It was this particular chain of events, this specific sequence of rock and fire and cold and slow biological change. And somewhere in that chain, a small, bright-eyed animal with a large brain and quick hands moved through a forest that no longer exists, in a world that did not survive. It was reaching toward something. It almost made it. And we are here, 66 million years later, still thinking about what that something might have been. Let that thought carry you gently into the dark, into the place where questions do not demand answers, where the weight of deep time becomes not a burden, but a kind of company. The long backward reach of the story of life on this planet. 4 billion years of trying, of branching and failing and trying again, of finding minds in the strangest places and losing them in the strangest moments, and somehow, through it all, continuing. You are part of that continuation. You are the current edge of it, the most recent and by no means the final word. And out there in the rock, in the badlands and the desert bluffs and the ancient seafloor sediments that hold the bones of the world that was, the record waits, patient and quiet, for the next question. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.